makes me cry, but otherwise it's all right. It's, of course, one of the great rewards of teaching is that somebody that you taught 20 years ago feels that way. I had such a terrible shock coming down on the airplane because I sat next to a woman who was reading Alice in Wonderland. And that sort of startled me. You know, I thought, well, it's a nice idea in a way. She was making notations of it, too. And so I thought, well, she can't be doing this just for herself, surely. And so I said, are you a teacher, or are you going to school or something? And she said no, and didn't. And then she looked at me and she said, you're a teacher, aren't you? And, you know, you always hate to be put in any category. You hate to have it show that you're in it. I think most people feel that way. And but I confessed. And then she asked me, see, this terrible question. How long have you been teaching? And, you know, I had never really added it up before. And here was this appalling figure. It was almost 50 years. And that's, I mean, I began in 1938. And here it is. And it was such a shock that I retired into the PSA magazine for 200 or 300 miles. But it is something that you know, you really don't think of it as being that long, because it's a perfectly extraordinary length of years for anybody to do anything, even breathe. You know. It's just astounding. But it has been something which I have thought about, and she made me think about even more of what an extraordinary thing it is to teach, even for a few years, much less for that number. And I thought of what we feel about teaching, and I've always been puzzled really about how they used to have what were called teachers' colleges. Now, some of you, I don't think even remember that phrase, but there was such a thing. And then they changed it to schools of education. And I always felt this was an unfortunate change. I never really analyzed why. You see, but then I looked up what teaching means and what the original root was, and it's Anglo-Saxon, and it simply means to show, just to present, to show. And of course, you always know what education means. It means leading out. And that the idea of just to show, and with it, of course, is always the sense of that you teach something. And whatever it is, you teach mathematics, you teach art, you teach horseback riding, you teach whatever it may be. But you teach that thing. But in the very use of the word education, you can't do that. You have to say you educate someone. Not that you can't say I educate mathematics, you see. You can't, that doesn't mean anything. Because what you're teaching has a kind of impersonal, eternal quality. And really quite eternal, you know. I was delighted one time to read in Xenophon that the way to bridle a horse. And it's exactly the way you have to bridle a horse. I mean, there's no monkey business. You can't go at a horse with a bit and say open, you know. And yet people do that. If you don't put your right arm up and hold the bridle by the top and put the left hand under the bit, you'll never get a horse bridled that doesn't want to be bridled. It's fine if they want to be bridled, and you can do anything, of course, stand on your head and bite them over with a sugar cube. But it's not, if you have a horse that doesn't care too much, which is, say, 98% of horses in the world, about being bridled, that's the way you've got to do it. You can't do it otherwise, you see. But see, there was a piece of teaching that he was giving 2,500 years ago, and it was just as useful today, just as powerful, just as absolutely important. And of course the same thing is true of anything that you teach. You teach the thing. You don't teach yourself. You don't even teach the people. You teach the thing. And if they learn it, that's good, you see. But if they don't, that doesn't matter. The thing is unchanged. The thing that you're teaching is unmodified, unchanged. But then you see with education, you get this other thing, which is the first definition is educate a child in the dictionary. And it means that you're pulling out the person out of what he is into something else. And this, of course, is a two-way thing, because it depends on you and the person receiving. It becomes an entirely different thing from just teaching. Because there you have a totally different responsibility, you have a totally different way of doing it. You can't do it the same way because there isn't a body that the child is that you want to turn it into. It's something which has to be mutual, has to be back and forth, and is just, it's a unique experience. Education is unique, and teaching is general, wide and general. And it's teaching something which is beyond you and beyond the learner, and which is going to be there when you're gone and when the learner's gone. But when the person who is educated, there's no such body you can turn to educate, because you have always the problem of whom you're educating. And that makes all of the difference in the world. It makes all the difference in how you do it and everything else. Now, as people working in this general profession, of course, we do both. We have to do both. And we can, in a sense, we can emphasize one or the other, but we really are always doing both. And consequently, it's a very difficult profession. It's a very dangerous and difficult profession. One of the advantages of being ancient is that you change your mind, you know. You have, say, between 30 and 40, you think something, and between 40 and 50, you think, no, that's not it, I think something else. And then you go back, maybe, and you know, it's a marvelous thing. You have this great, wonderful range of what you can think, and there's time to correct it, or just modify it, or just change it out of whimsy, or do anything. But I think that one of the things that I have thought from different times, one was that anybody that teaches, a teacher should be insane, as close to insane as not actually certifiable. Because when I look back on my own, the people that taught me, the nuttier they were, the more I learned. And the nuttier they were, the better it was. You know, it was. And furthermore, it was something to remember them by. And I had an absolutely mad English teacher in the 8th grade who had been a refugee from she taught the Tsar, if you please, before and during the Revolution, and had marvelously and magically escaped. She was British, and we were not allowed to move in the class. And what she did, you had to sit absolutely still. And if you moved at all, this was 8th grade. She would fly into a temper, one of the most dramatic tempers I've ever seen. She would turn purple, and she wore clothes. She wore one of those high neck, things that people, and a huge white blouse and long skirt to the ground, and her hair in a pompadour. She was dressed easily 50 years before the time. And she would go into such a rage that the most recalcitrant, the most nervous, the most jumpy person remained still for the next 2 hours. You couldn't move. And then what she did was read us Chaucer in Old English. She expected us to take this in, and if we didn't, well, it was just too bad. You see, she was teaching Chaucer. She didn't care about what was being received or what we were doing at all. But see, I remember her, and furthermore, I remember a good deal of Chaucer because of her. So it's something that I stayed with. I had other mad teachers because I went to girls' school. I think that since there were no men there, women could be as mad as they pleased. You know how that is. So I had others to impress my girlish mind as well. But then I began to think that was not that the teacher should be as sane as possible, just as really divinely sane as it was possible to be. And I thought that people maybe should never teach who want to teach. That to want to teach is already bad news, you see. It's bad. It shows that you have bad aspects to your nature, that you want to teach. And so that people, perhaps who have to teach, they should have to do like the bishops in the early church. They had to say, non episcopari sum, you know, I am not a bishop. And that was while they were being ordained. They had to announce, I think they still do, don't they, have to say that, or something like it? I hope they do. I strongly suspect they don't. If they do, they're probably lying, as the bishops that I've known. They begin to say episcopari sum 2 years out of. So anyway, maybe the teacher should say that, you see. And then I think, because I think that it's an awful thing to say, I want to be something. I'm constantly haunted by students, you know, who say, I want to be a painter. They don't want to paint, they want to be a painter. And I want to be a writer. They don't want to write, they want to be a writer. And there's all the difference in the world, you see. And the one is sentimental and really actually fatal and usually based on something that has no ground at all. And the other is something which is genuine. So if you say, I want to be a teacher, you're probably thinking of summer vacations. You know, I mean, that's really true, isn't it? And if you say, I want to teach, you have something that you very much want other people to know about. And you want them, it's something which is valuable, something which is precious and valuable, and you want them to have this thing too. So it's a very different thing to say I want to be a teacher or I want to teach. But the whole thing is very difficult. You see, the whole thing is very dangerous. It's dangerous because you never know what you're teaching. You never know what you're educating. And I think that all teachers should always remember that Alexander the Great's tutor was Aristotle. And if anybody knows anything at all about Aristotle, they know something around the golden mean, nothing in excess, you know, all of this stuff. And so Alexander the Great dies of excess, dissipation, by the age of 33, and that takes a lot of doing. That takes a lot, particularly when you're doing a lot of physical exercises and core and things like that take up a lot of slack. If you have the time to be that dissipated, that drunk actually, and just plain dissipated, you know, you haven't paid much attention to your teacher. Now, you've got to realize that Aristotle must have been a marvelous teacher. I suppose you had him in your bibliography, you know, I mean, your bio-bib, or whatever you call it, taught by Aristotle. It's not a good thing. I mean, he obviously wasn't teaching, he wasn't educating, he wasn't teaching, he wasn't, goodness knows what he was doing. But anyway, and then you have this awful, my favorite example of a failed teacher is Seneca, you know, taught dear old Nero. And Seneca is the most austere creature that ever was, if you ever read much of him or about him or anything. I mean, he was a genuine old-fashioned Roman in gravitas and in all those things. And then Nero becomes the name that everybody knows as simply awful, you know. I mean, really no good. And I don't think anyone defends Nero. I know there's so much revisionism going on in the world. There's probably somebody who's saying he really was an early Christian and a saint, was just doing this to show people how disastrous it was for anybody to be so awful. So anyway, otherwise Nero remains unblemished as a really sad case, and certainly Seneca did his best. So we have that always before us, that we don't know what we're going to teach, and we may never find out. I had an extraordinary experience. just about a month or two ago, a friend of mine was down in Los Angeles, and she went to a big cocktail party and got talking to someone and said she was from Santa Cruz. And they said, "Oh, do you know?" And this man said, "Do you know Mary Holmes?" "Oh, yes, I know her." And he said, his face changed. He said, "She changed my life." And my friend Beverly, who has got her feet on the ground, said, "How?" He couldn't say anything. He just burbled, and he said, "She changed my life." And he was like, 40 years old. And she said, well, she thought she'd try another tack, and she said, "Well, what do you do now? How do you do?" He said, "I make pornographic underwear." Now, I promise you, that wasn't what I was teaching. It wasn't what I was trying to educate him. There was no question that I was amazed at this. Really, she didn't get his name, darn it. She, of course, was so stunned at the ticket, but she couldn't even bother to ask him. She just hastened back to Santa Cruz and told me. So, but I'd like to write him a note. But anyway, it is a very dangerous profession. If you keep at it long enough, or if you don't. I mean, the results are. You may see the results if you keep at it long enough, and otherwise you suspect them. And the whole thing should always be approached with a great sense of the danger involved, the actual physical danger of the alterations that you may make in people that you had no intention to make at all. So instead of it being what most people think, you see, when they think, "I want to be a teacher," they think, "Well, I've got nice vacations, and it's kind of undemanding, and you can be sort of gentle and sweet and get along, and not cutthroating, and so on." The other dangers are just as great, and you've got always to remember this. Keep that in mind, that you're walking on tightrope, because you are trying to do these two things which are different. You're trying to teach, and you're trying to educate. And it's a fortunate thing that people are educable. They are, and I think that the very first, inherent in the word, to lead out. What you lead out from is the self. You lead out from what you are, from the self, and into whatever it may be. But the absolute first step is to get out of the self, to escape that, and to begin to, in a sense, to see that there's another world, that there are other people, and there's another world. Now, we're very fortunate, all of us, by having a gift for that. We have a natural gift to move out of ourselves, and it's called empathy. We see something, we feel as though we were that kind of thing. It's the easiest thing in the world to demonstrate, because I think everybody's been in the situation where they were maybe in high school or in grade school or anywhere, or in an actual great theater, where you're sitting there and the person who is supposed to be performing forgets whatever it is. They don't know what they're going to say. And everybody's reaction is the same, or almost everybody's. And what is it? Embarrassment, isn't it? You feel your own ears getting pink. You feel this awful sense of not being able to breathe, and you are embarrassed. And you are in the situation in life in which you are, in a sense, least possibly embarrassed. Because you're sitting with a whole group of other people not doing anything in the dark. And that is absolutely a wonderfully unembarrassing situation. But you're not really there, you're up there on the stage. You see, you're living in what's going on in the stage. And so when something happens on the stage, you are caught into it as if it were your fault. Because in a sense, you have made it your fault. Because you move out of yourself entirely. Now, everybody knows this. Because if there's one thing that everybody always says about anything that they enjoy, they always say, "I lost myself." They always say, "I went to a concert, I simply lost myself. I was in this movie, I lost myself." And it's a phrase which is used over and over. I lost any sense of time. I lost, in other words, your whole physical, actual self. You lose totally in any situation of enjoyment. Doesn't matter what, any kind. You lose yourself. And then, of course, you also come back to yourself, because you always do, but yourself is different when you get back. And so that marvelous exchange in which you lose yourself in order to find yourself is the whole business of education. It's all this pulling of yourself out and then being able to go back. But now animals do that, there's no question about it. Animals understand empathic responses. You can do like this and they know what it means. And you can do any number, of course. All sheepdogs are guided entirely by the least kind of gesture, because they know what that means, both in terms of meaning, but they learned it by its empathic meaning, of how they knew what it meant to feel that way, and they felt it. Not with the self-consciousness that we do. But we have another funny, special, strange, absolutely unique gift that no one else has. And that is that we can do this empathizing into an absolutely abstract thing, like a word, like a picture. We can do that, and nobody else can. The animals cannot do that. And yet all of us have this gift immediately, absolutely, as children. I always like to give an illustration of that, and some of you can see it, maybe. Because if I put this on the board, it's just a circle. I'll move that over. Can you see that? You come in the room, you say that's a circle, you don't think much of it. And I have to just make the least modification. And you know what it is, you see. I don't have to go on. And going on was just me doing that. Then I can go on like this. And when I finally get to this, and anybody, tiny child, you see, come in the room and say, cat. Any cat in the world can come in the room and never say cat. Never. I mean, it won't. Not only won't say cat, but it won't, you know, it's absolutely divinely indifferent to this representation of the cat. Now, why is that? It's because we have this extraordinary power that we can empathize and comprehend absolutely abstract forms. And we can lose ourselves again in them. And you have that, of course, over and over proved. It's a marvelous thing that when you read a scary book or you go to a scary movie, why do you hide, you know? when you're reading a scary book, now imagine anything, you're safe, you're on the 15th floor of a building in a quiet and pleasant town, and you're locked in your room, and it's light and nice, and you're reading this book, and you hear a funny noise on the window pane. And your hair stands up on the back of your neck, and you are frozen with fear. Because you're in the world of the book, where it's perfectly suitable to be frozen with fear, but you're in an actual world where it's absolutely unsuitable, you know. But nonetheless, of course, we do, and that's why they keep on being able to write those books, and we keep on buying them. Because we can have this marvelous experience, which is absolutely real, but in another world. So it's the reality of the abstract world that we turn into the real world with this marvelous gift that we have. And that is an education, you see, because we move out, we move into something else, and we have then a whole new comprehension. You see, I believe everybody in the room read Black Beauty. Is that true? Did you read Black Beauty, all of you? If not, you better be like the lady on the airplane and start over. Because you should read Black Beauty. And in that, you are a horse, you see. You are actually a horse. And you know what it is to suffer. You know what it is. I would no more put a check rein on a horse, which of course doesn't happen commonly now anyway, but because of that book. And the sense of getting inside of another whole scale of being, you see, is enormously valuable. Or Stuart the mouse, you know, or that wonderful thing about the pig, you know, with with all these wonderful stories that enable people to escape from themselves. And that's the first requirement of education. And that escape is something which we all have to have. You see, there's no use in taking a puritanical attitude toward escape. Some people say, oh, art's just escape. I'd like to know how they could stand themselves if they didn't have that escape. They couldn't. There's never been a human being who went even one day without escaping himself. Because you'd be hopelessly destroyed. Totally destroyed. We know, you see, we have this funny business that we know as we get older, we know that life narrows down and we are in a prison of ourselves, and the prison of our time, and the prison of our place. And we are in that prison. And then because we are what we are, we cannot stand it. But we also love it. So we have this wonderful thing called art, and really any dedication that allows us to move out of the prison and come back refreshed to the prison. And no more than we knew before, because we actually learn. We learn when we do that. Now, it doesn't mean that we learn something good, because we can learn something terrible. We can read pornography and learn what there's a thing of joy and suffering, and other people's suffering, and joy in cruelty, joy in debasement, joy in our own destruction of ourselves. And the same thing is acting. You see, as if we were reading Yeats or Shakespeare or Emily Dickinson or something else, or looking at a great painting. See, this is our power, and it's also our possible terrible danger that we can do this. So how we escape and where we escape, what we escape to, is of the greatest importance. And we get ourselves educated emotionally and in terms of feeling through this exit from ourselves, this abandonment of ourselves into something else. And it's the most precious thing in the world, of course. And you see, it makes a terrible difference whether it's a football game or whether it's a great novel. It makes an enormous difference. But both are acting that way. And maybe we need all kinds. I mean, maybe we need every kind in order to become really educated, fully educated. And again, this is only what I'm thinking now in my 70s, and I maybe thought the opposite. You should never have, I was never, thank God, like those people who wouldn't ever let their children read funny papers. You don't. I hope that's gone out. Has it gone out? I don't know. I know that some people pride themselves on not letting their children watch television. Well, television is terrible for the most part, and funny papers are idiotic for the most part. But it's still, it enriches, it educates, and it gives you a kind of thing to play off against, something that you can move. Knowing more about yourself through that, you can finally see it. And of course, everybody does that. I know that you all, when you were little, liked something. When you were adolescent, you maybe liked something and were swept away by it, and then you read it later and you thought, that's a bunch of silliness, And that's why, because you've been educated, you see, by this very act, so that your own self not only has escaped, but is returned wiser than it was. Now, you see, what can a teacher do in this? A teacher, I think, can enable you, actually give you the opportunity to escape into something which is valuable, to escape into something which really will enlarge your vision and humanize you, make you as great a human being as you can be, rather than the least human being that you can be. Now, I have some slides to show you, because I suppose one of the things which is most important about education is that it is a unique situation every time it occurs. And that the uniqueness, our own uniqueness, is one of the things which we have always to remember. Because, it's just astounding that there is no duplication. I believe that there are no two things alike in the entire world. I believe that. I don't think any man-made object, I think that's why we can find our cars in a parking lot. We don't know how they're different, and it is very subtle differences, aren't they? It doesn't have to be a squashed fender, which makes it a lot easier, but you begin to know the curve of the bumper. You begin to know, so you just see a little piece of it, that's my bumper, curved that way. And you see a little part of the top, yep, that's mine. And these things are very subtle, but they enable you, literally, your apprehension of them enables you to find the things. And their uniqueness seems absolutely, you think there's no such thing. They're not. Exactly as a number of people in the world today make us think that people are not unique. But they are. And at the same time, we're learning absolutely that every hair on your head is your hair, not anybody else's. And you can hang for it. And every cell of your body, not just your fingerprints, not just your voice print, not these obvious things, but your entire self is absolutely unique, has never occurred before and will never occur again. And that you always have to remember. But also, you see, you have to get out of that. And you have to see that this experience that you have, this experience which you learned from your teacher, developed from your teacher, is not unique, is unique, but is not unique. So that you have to become able, in a sense, to deal with that paradox. That it is your emotion, but that this emotion has been felt forever and a day. I think most of you have had this experience when you were little and read love poetry. And some way there was something calling to you in that. And then when you were an adolescent and fell in love, the poetry became a totally different thing. Now, do you remember that? It seemed to be written right for you, and often was written by you, so that it was it was an intense and personal thing. Though it might be a passage, say, from Sappho that had been forever and a day, So that body of experience is continuous, but your experience of the experience is unique. And one of the greatest things that any kind of education brings about is the recognition of our shared lives, our shared emotions, and the actuality of their being able to be at once absolutely ours and absolutely belonging to time, belonging to the whole world. And it's very hard to hold any kind of paradox like that in the mind, but you really have to do it, because it's the only way I think that you can ever educate or ever be educated, because it doesn't stop. So it doesn't really stop at all. Things still can educate you. I know I was educated only the last 2 weeks in the New Yorker by the wonderful articles on the training of dogs and horses. I don't know how many of you read those things. Weren't they marvelous? Absolutely marvelous. And as long as I've cared about horses and dogs and cats, to me it was an education to read it. Just the same, it pulled me out and then let me go back with a whole new richness about the very things that I cared a great deal about. And that happens all the time. But it's this paradoxical relationship in which you recognize that it is your thing, but it is also the human thing. And I have a feeling that, of course, we always think that the thing that we teach is the most valuable, and the other things are all right, but including reading, writing, and arithmetic. You think, well, yes, I guess well, I suppose so. But what we teach is the thing. That's going to be the real thing. So I can't help feeling that the history of art is. Now, why do I think that? I'm going to justify it for a moment. It's more than literature, because you don't have to have any language, and nothing can be translated. It isn't possible any more than we can be translated. Well, we may be translated like bottom, but we are not apt to be translated. And any kind of literature requires that. And you may get a wonderful translation, so that the Germans think that Shakespeare really was German, you know, because their language is adaptable, and the Italians probably wonder what the hell the fuss is about, you know, because it's like my favorite thing in the French New Testament, which is "Heureux les débonnaires," you know, which we translate immediately as "happy are the debonair," and it's a translation of "blessed are the meek." See, if you grew up reading, "Heureux les débonnaires," you couldn't help being quite different, I think. So there really isn't any hope of translation. You have to know that. And other things have, you know, the other arts have, dance is lost. Much of drama requires translation. But the paintings and sculpture are right there. And there's nothing between. See, there's nothing in between except yourself. Which is an exception. But it's there for you to receive if you can. And you will immediately, whether you want to or not makes no difference, you will immediately empathize into it. Everybody does. You can't help it. You just do. And then you learn what it is, because you are that thing while you're looking at it. And you learn all kinds of things through that. Let's look at some slides. One of the funny things, I suppose, that's most fascinating, I put this in just to make you recall. This is a painting by an unimportant person who painted this picture of Aristotle teaching Alexander the Great. So maybe you can work out from that why Alexander didn't learn. But maybe you can't. It's such a refreshing image of Aristotle, isn't it? You know, this sort of strapping, active young athlete with his curly hair. But anyway, let's look at the next one.
You have to change it.
Oh, I have the thing, yeah. I'm always doing this wrong. I have a... Yeah, there. See, one of the most astounding, one of the most difficult things for any of us ever to believe or to know is that there were real people living before us and in places where we don't know. And I think this picture of this piece of sculpture of Rahotep and Nefert, which is from Egypt, the very earliest time, the Old Kingdom, and that is toward the end, around 2600 maybe, BC. Now, these people could walk right into the room dressed like this, and we wouldn't even notice, you know. We'd think, well, they're from Beverly Hills. Because the lady has a certain amount of jewelry that is rather prominently displayed, and she'd have to take her hand down, or you'd wonder, but otherwise, she's got on a, you know, perfectly acceptable garment and looks exactly like people you know. And so does he. He's something of a twerp, isn't he? You know, and she is. He has a face that constantly reappears. And I'm sure that you're all thinking, oh, he looks like so and so, because he does. Because we have only this narrow range in which we can exist or appear. We have a narrow range in terms of what we can stand and a lack of oxygen, and what we can do with the tiny number of features we have on a very small area called our face. And they can only be arranged a certain way. The miracle is that even identical twins are not identical. And so here he is appearing 4,000 years ago, and looking just like people we know. Oops, back. And there's another. Can that be sharpened a little bit? Because this is very, yeah, that's better. See, we know that the person who painted this looked at this actual person and that he actually lived. And when you see it as a tail close up, you see, now, you feel what that is. You feel that kind of curious sobriety and seriousness that goes with this kind of face. You know, this kind of face is not a joke-telling face. It's an entirely different one. And you feel that. You feel that you know what that is. And it's an immediate apprehension, immediate experience of the thing. And these are all from the Ghent, all the piece. Everybody looks like a person and is. And furthermore, they look like a type. So they're both things, exactly as your experience is both things. That this is a unique experience, and it's absolutely unique. There's no way in the world any work of art can be reproduced at all satisfactorily. It is absolutely unique, but it's also large enough and general enough so that you have the conviction of the endurance of a certain type, of the endurance of a certain face, and of a certain life. This wonderfully fashionable lady, that detailing. You see, you know what that whole thing is. You know people like her, you know the whole, your experience is as if you really had met this person because you instantly flow into it. And if you allow yourself to do it. Now, one of the best things about showing people works of art by slides, which is always a distortion, is that at least they're in the dark, and they are therefore able to lose themselves into the thing, really quite readily. If they know that that's what they're supposed to do. They're not supposed simply to identify it, to say this was done by so-and-so at such and such, but to experience it. And this curious caginess, and that you can see, I think this is a wonderful painting to illustrate the fact that the word foxy has the meaning that it has now. It has there is something foxy about her face, which is at once sly and sexy. And it's a very strong feeling of that. Very curious. And with it a kind of timidity or startledness at her own self. And then when you see Roman portraits, you know the Romans adored portraits so that you immediately, now this is Agrippa, and you know that it looked like that. The Romans didn't want to look handsome or beautiful or anything, they wanted to look like themselves. And they're the only people in the world who ever were so desperately pleased to have their images made that they would rent pedestals in the Forum to put their images on. And it wasn't that they were, it wasn't that they were running for office or something, though the ones that were running for office just put that many more, like the billboards, but they just, that was it. And everybody in their family had a little sculptured head, and furthermore, they made them different sizes, so that when they traveled with them like you would with an album of pictures, And you imagine, it's like the Spartans with their iron money, because you had to carry this satchel full of little portrait heads that big and smaller, so that you could show Grandma what the children looked like. It was a passion to hold on to the looks of what the person was. And they were successful in it. You get these marvelous, marvelous images that you know immediately are the real person, as much as possible. This is Augustus Caesar. And you see that curious idealism and sensitivity and still something else in his face that would make it possible for him to be Augustus Caesar. Very, very fascinating, sensitive figure. And I love to show this to people who ever sing in groups, and I know this morning that you sing in groups, and you know the faces that people make when they sing. And here, again from the Ghent piece, you have these faces that have been being made by people singing for hundreds of years, and this is testimony to it. You see, this is exactly what that curious sort of sick look that some people have when they're singing, and other people very ardent, and you can almost hear, what they're singing. I'll bet you anything that she's an alto, don't you? She's this one. She can't. You never make that face if you're trying to sing high, or want to sing low. And you see it, and you can almost hear them singing when you see this. So that again, that just expands your life to know that these things are constant. They are also absolutely typical, and yet they're constant. Now I want to show you a series of things of the same, paintings of the same subject matter, and this is the Madonna and Child, and you can see something else that the history of art can show you as nothing else can, because every work of art is always the result of choices. It can't be otherwise. You can't extrude art. You have to just make it. And anything that you make has to be based on a choice. You cannot make unless you choose. And you choose the size, you choose the medium, you choose, everything. You have to choose. And there's only one way to choose, and that's on value. You say, this is what I want, not the other. And that's an absolute affirmation of value. Every time you make anything, whether it's a dress or your face made up or anything that you do as a human being, has to be based on choices. Now, don't tell me about there being no free will, because I don't care what that is, all that to do is about, because we act as if, and we judge other people as if they chose. And the greatest thing that was ever done in that line was a young lady who sat in a philosophy course and heard that there was no such thing as free will. At the end of the lecture, she threw her book at the professor's head. And of course, he couldn't. How could he suggest that this was not right? She wasn't responsible for it. She had no free will. But of course, we know that we do choose, and it doesn't matter whether it's an illusion in the divine scheme. We choose. And when you make a work of art, when you do anything, you have to choose. And that the only way you can choose is because this is more valuable than that. And so when you see the same subject matter, the Madonna and Glory, and this in the early 14th century, and then you see it moving along. Oh, am I going the wrong way? What? No, I'm not.
I don't know, something's hung up on all sides. Go the other way. One more.
Yes, there's Giotto. And you see what's happened to that first one. But the whole thing has changed. And she's charming and delightful and, sweet, and everything about it. And the little angels are all so nice. Remember those terrible severe ones at the beginning? All of that changes as the world moves into the Renaissance. And here you have a kind of variation on that, where the whole quality of sacredness is gone from this. And if you look into it and feel that way, feel your hands being like that. Is that the way to feel toward God? No, it's not. Honestly, if you're doing that toward God, I think it's not a successful move. So, because it has that whole element of self-consciousness and in really preoccupation with the self and with the physical world. There's another delightful one of the Madonna and Child in heaven, and with St. George, and look at his dragon over there in the corner. See that very small dragon? Not really, not much of a challenge to St. George. Not really any. But imagine, when these pictures were painted, these were the only pictures you saw. They didn't have museums. You didn't go around and try one here and try one there. This was in your church, and you saw it, and you saw it every day. You saw it all the time. So it just deeply educated you toward this conception, and it was something which you couldn't escape even, because it was happening to you all the time. And what was happening here is just totally different from what was happening in this picture. It's just a totally different thing. Let's see if we can get farther down. Now, why is that doing
You're
that?
hitting the wrong button. Try the other.
Okay, I'll hit another. No, sir.
One more.
Oh, yes. It's so wonderful. One of the worst corruptions of the world is that you begin to love things which are awful. And this can happen to you in any profession, but I think it's very apt to happen to you in teaching, because you you see so many things which are really, you begin to see how funny something is, which is awful. And I hate to say that this is awful, but it is awful. It's not at all fashionable in art historical circles to say that something is awful. You're supposed to say entirely different things about it. But this is. And it's supposed to be, it's the judgment of Paris, you know, that great and terrible important thing when Paris, the shepherd, a very curious get-up for a shepherd, like his horse too, don't you? And not to mention Cupid up above. And he gives, of course, the apple to Venus because she's so beautiful, and she promises him a beautiful woman. And remember, the other goddesses promised him victory and promised him knowledge and all these splendid things, but he thought, I'd really rather have a very beautiful woman. And so he chose Venus. And she proved this by taking her clothes off, you know, which is a very compelling argument. And so here they are, you know. But of course they are being here in the 16th century, and the poor people in Germany had seen and heard all about the Italian Renaissance and how you could make great splendid figures, human figures were semi-divine, they were so marvelous, and all of that business, and that man really was the center of the world and so on. But they can't believe it. They can't really believe it. And so they make this effort toward it. And then they translate it into that he's really a knight instead of a shepherd. And Mercury is a very ancient old man, you know. And think of the Italian Mercuries at the same time. And look at the effort to make the figure at ease. Because, see, the great thing of the Italian Renaissance was that you could use any gesture, any figure, you could see them upside down, flying, and all those kind of marvelous things. And you knew how that looked, and people had not known it before. They really, because they hadn't believed that you should. They couldn't believe that you should know it. And then, so he thinks, what you have to do is turn the body. So look what he does, you see, and you get this extraordinary figure on the right. I mean, just really something. All of them. And then I guess it's Juno, who's sitting, you know, has this gesture, which is the gesture of pregnant women and the gesture of old people who just sit, they're resting their hands on their stomachs, you see, and on their arms on their stomachs. It's exactly what she's doing. It really is not a very grandiose vision. Here you can see them close up. They're also flirtatious, you know, and hoping that he'll choose them. and Venus is quite pleased with this and has a lovely hat. And she has, you know, such a marvelous expression, doesn't she? Absolutely. She looks like Miss California. You know? Here I am. It's so great, you know. And then look at what only a few years later is Rubens with the same subject matter, and all of these wonderful, full, handsome but naked ladies. Nobody in the North ever was able to conceive of a nude. There's no nude painting. There are lots of naked ladies in the 17th century, but that concept of the ideal nude, it doesn't exist. And I have a dear friend who's convinced that it's because it's so cold. You couldn't get used to it, and you couldn't. It's like that great thing, you know, when Canova made this sculpture of Josephine, and she's nude to the waist, and somebody said, "How could you do that?" And she said, "He had a good stove." You see, it's probably true that the nude doesn't exist in the North because there's not enough good stoves. Anyway, these wonderful, and Paris has gone back to being a shepherd, Mercury's gone back to being a god, and Cupid is next to his mother. So it's a total change. And the vision of man and the vision of the world in the vision of mythology, everything she's undergone in a short period of time, this enormous change. And this is the 17th century version of the Judgment of Paris. And there comes Paris in from the right, and there are the goddesses. Juno with her peacock, and Athena, angry as could be, and Venus, of course, smirking away there. But what's happened in the 18th century? This is about the middle of the 18th century. And what's happened? People don't take this any kind of seriousness anymore. They don't take anything about it with any seriousness, because they're dominated by a feeling of reason, and the reason, of course, is clear out of the picture when you start talking about the judgment of gods and goddesses. It's just clear on out, so that you can have a lot of fun, but you really couldn't ever make a serious one. And then somebody comes along like Blake and can make a serious one, though again now it's transformed really into a poetic statement and into a mystical statement. So that you see Mercury flying away is so different. And it's all the thing becomes a whole moral and a profoundly disturbing and moral image. Not at all like what's gone on before. And then with the late 19th century, you have Renoir with the same subject matter, and let's just think of what has happened. And what's happened is what's happened everywhere, not just in art, but in everything. That's what it is, that the reality has changed. And here you have the sense of the fertility, the idea of a fertile and of a pagan world, idealized, but nonetheless exactly what it is. Not of divine beings, but simply of human beings who lived at a marvelous time when they could be really their strong, physical, voluptuous selves. And this is a 20th century painting by a California artist of the Judgment of Paris.
Oh my God.
And you see, it tells you exactly what's going on everywhere. You don't have to look any farther, you know exactly what is thought about the meaning of the thing, what is thought about the actuality of judgment, what is thought about everything, and how cruelly stark it is, and how everything is literally demeaned as far as it can be. All the goddesses, the Venuses, the Athena, Juno. What does that really mean? You know? And yet it's painted and it's accepted and it's hung, and there it is. Now I'd like to show you two more things which are again an extraordinary illustration of the different meanings of the world. And this is part of what education is, to find and to know those different meanings. And I'll show you two things of the same subject matter, the crucifixion. They were painted only about 30 years apart, but they are as profoundly different as you could ask anything, two things to be. One of them is the Perugino, painted in Italy. You see, everything is clear. It is a world of absolute order, of wonderful, divine order, where the sky is blue, where the suffering is not great. Why not? Simply because it is known that this is for something. That the crucifixion is not just an event of suffering of a single person. It is the meaning of the redemption of the world. And therefore, it is a joyous thing. And the people are only mildly, they're not really grief-struck. And then when you see the Grunewald painted in the north, you have exactly the opposite. This is a thing which forces you to know, empathically, you know the terrible weight of the body. You know the awful suffering of the people. You see the Virgin falls into the arms of St. John, she's just literally fainting in her agony. And the Magdalene is just overwrought. I mean, she's just hysterical. Her face is swollen with crying. Her eyes and nose are red. She's just completely given over to her own agony at the death of Christ. And then, of course, and you think, well, that's realism. But the figure on the right is St. John the Baptist, who, of course, is long dead. And he says, he will increase, I will diminish. And the Lamb. Another world. Another entirely different world. Of another. Now see, suppose this is the image in your church, and you go and you see it all the time. This is what you see. This is the meaning of the crucifixion that you see. It's a matter of terrible, intense, unique, private suffering. And you can guess, of course, in which this was painted almost exactly the same time that Martin Luther put his theses on the door. Almost exactly the same year, as far as we can tell. Because it's the same world. Here's another nice, same change, in which you can see what can be an understanding of something and what is the opposite. This is the resurrection period of La Francesca. Again, that world is orderly. The world is a divine world. It's a world which is not, which contains us, but is not determined by us. And when you see this resurrection of Grunewald, you have the whole sense of the miraculous nature. The fact that he explodes from the tomb, and that all of the figures are thrown exactly as by an explosion. And he has become another thing. He's become a part of the world of the spirit. And then look at this marvelous, really provincial vision of the resurrection. It's so great, because you feel absolutely this figure is going to get out of that grave, and nothing's going to stop. I mean, it's so marvelous. There's more energetic rejection of death in that figure than in either of the others. And the people that are around are sleeping because they're just really such, lunks. They're just hopeless idiots. And Christ has got to be about his business. And that's what his business is, resurrection. So it's an extraordinary change. It's a totally different world. And then one of the great things that looking at these things is that it can establish certain emotions, or can give us a vision of emotions that are very difficult to achieve. And while we can look at the thing, we can feel that emotion. And in this image of Buddha, there is such calm, such extraordinary transcendence over the world and over the ordinary experiences that we have, that you can't help feeling it, because you empathize into this and see what they've done with the human figure. It's not like any kind of ordinary figure. It's not like any that you ever saw, but it convinces us as a figure. And then one of the most beautiful and extraordinary images, this image of Buddha. And the image of Buddha was created out of a combination of the image of Apollo and the Indian figures that existed, very, very few, before the coming of Alexander. And there's no way in which you can find words. You see, this is what's so marvelous about the visual arts, that they don't require words, because you experience them, and the words, you cannot actually find words to say what this is, what this feels like when you look at it. There's no way to find those words, because they all contradict each other. There's kind of irony, there's an infinite sense of compassion or understanding, a feeling of remoteness. How you're going to combine compassion and absolute aloofness or remoteness, We can't do it with words, but we can do it with an image. And in seeing that and experiencing it, there is an expansion of the self that allows you to know this. And here, this wonderful, one of my absolute favorite Madonnas of Child, because It's the most uncomfortable and most terrible that you could ever possibly imagine or paint. And see, the nice thing is that somebody, not only somebody, great numbers of people thought, oh, that's it. That's what we want. And I dare you to take which you've already done in your minds, not in your minds, but in your whole bodies, take the position that she has and tell me that she's a good mother. And I must say that Christ child is a condition of absolute unconsciousness, which is fortunate. Of course, he's about to fall on the ground. In addition, she won't care because she is the ultimate fashionable lady, isn't she? She's absolutely, if you want to be fashionable, you need a long neck, you need a small head, you need to make this gesture. And right away you're fashionable. I can't do it because my shoulders are too wide. But if you have a long neck and a tiny head, you're well ahead toward being fashionable. Always, at any time. And here she is, the most fashionable and absolutely disinterested. And then the artist has made this even more extraordinary and set up all kinds of tensions because he's crammed. I never can remember how many people in that tiny space that's beside her. It's packed full of angels, one of which is something of a striptease artist, as you can see. And imagine now that this is in your chapel, and this is the picture you come to every day, 2 or 3 times a day, to get an idea of what the Madonna. Not to get it, but because you can't help get it. And then what would be the result of that? And then the power to see something which is just wonderfully like a cream puff. So much of French painting is heureuse et debonaire. You see, she's really wonderfully heureuse and extremely debonair. So it has that charm and that quality. And it's opposite of this. Where you see the terror of life. This is really, I suppose, one of the worst images of the crucifixion or the coming of the crucifixion, where Christ is simply surrounded by the most awful people that you can imagine, and he's lost, you see, in the center of that. He's lost under the terrible weight of the cross. And then everybody else, they're all there to see the sport. And they're all, look at the repentant thief down on the right and the unrepentant thief, getting help from these terrible priests. I have a detail of that, you see. Everybody is just so awful. I mean, it's the farthest thing in the world. It gives you some, and what everybody has to know, really, to be educated, they have to know that there's immense cruelty in the human heart, that there's immense joy and pain and suffering in the human heart. And that there is no way that you can sweeten that over. It is true. And when you see this shown really before you, this kind of sniveling, creepy cruelty and meanness of spirit in everybody except the Christ, who's absolutely helpless there. Here's another, also by Bosch. The last years in his life, you see, were very different from his earlier painting. And here again, you have the joy of cruelty and the helplessness of virtue, the helplessness of the good. And the good is actually the prey of what is powerful, what is armored, what is evil, enjoying, happy in it. And one of the things which you can see in this is that the terribleness of loss of the beloved. And the sense of this as being dead, the quality of absolute hopeless death of this figure, the rigidity of the body. And when you see what you experience when you experience this, and I hate to even speak in front of it, but you know something about the depth of grief over loss. It's so great that it doesn't show in the face. It shows in the gesture, in the touching of the head, and in the absolute desolation of the Madonna. the absolute desolation of the mother at the death of the son. So for looking at this, you can feel it, you can know it. And there's no better way to train you in the depth of emotion than to be able to experience it in this sense. So that when you have to experience it in the world, you have in a sense already experienced it. And you can then give yourself to it totally, that you can really know what that means, to lose something that you love. And then you can love, in this painting of Rembrandt's, I suppose the most difficult thing that we ever can learn as human beings, and most of us never can learn it at all. We never learn it as long as we live, and that is forgiveness. We cannot, it's one of the most difficult things in the world, to forgive and to accept forgiveness. And when you look at this extraordinary and difficult story of the prodigal son, nothing could be more perplexing and more distressing than the story of the prodigal son, because you remember, he only returned to his father because things had gotten so terrible that he thought, the servants in my father's house are much better off than this. I'll just go back and be a servant. And he goes back and is forgiven and given the place of honor, and the fatted calf is killed. And the brother, who was always there, wonders. But because he can't understand forgiveness any more than the rest of us can. But the father understands it, and the son understands it. And when you see a detail of the son, and you see that is a forgiven head. The way it lies against his father, it is a forgiven head. And the hands forgive him. And if you enter into that and you live it, even for a short time, you at least have a vision of forgiveness. You may never achieve forgiveness yourself, but you have the vision of it. Thank you very much.